Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Season 3 of the Educator Wellness Revolution. How are your all summers?
We're good. It's restful.
It's great. It's gone for almost a month. So, we're education never stops except for, July is kind of a reprieve from it all. So it just kind of took almost all of July off, and it's the opportunity to, recharge. So it was great.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think you had the most exciting summer. I
was in Mexico for almost 3 weeks of it. Did a lot of exploring and had a lot of fun with family. So it was great.
Cool. I got away a little bit. I think like the central part of our summer was our daughter got her tonsils out, which was like a big recovery.
Less enjoyable.
It was less enjoyable, but I feel like it's like that wellness where you're like, we needed to get it done. We needed a long time to recover from it. And now I feel so good once it's done. So I'm feeling, and she's like doing so much, like she can breathe now. So that's really good. Yeah. Well, we wanted to start off our season thinking about some overarching themes that we're going to explore throughout the season. And what we came to was an episode on something that we call human-centered leadership. And Scott, I'm going to kick it to you because I think this is a term that you've really been excited about and run with.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really the difference in what we see in schools all the time is whether we feel like leadership is human-centered and the ripple effect that has personally on staff people, but then throughout the staff culture. And it's not just whether staff are happy and whether staff stay. I felt by the students, I think it's felt throughout the whole school culture. So we'll talk more about how we see it and what we think it is, how we've seen it show up and not show up in school environments. But I think it's a great way to start the season because it's just fundamental, I think, to whether schools not just see success in the short term, but whether they actually sustain that success over the long term, whether they really, feel trust with each other and whether they, treat each other with basic human dignity in their everyday interactions.
Yeah, well, and we say that Empower Ed is an organization that is human-centered and policy-oriented. So Caroline, as coming on right now, really working on the policy, what do you think that means to you?
Human-centered and policy-oriented, I think, means that we're designing policies that are asset-based, right? They're not assuming that people are just automated machines, that we're understanding that they have needs. They have their own, like we said, they have their own resources that they can bring to the table. And so I think this idea of human-centered and policy-oriented is really leading with the idea that we are people's first, and all of the numbers, the data, all of that follows afterwards. But we have to center the folks that are at the front line, so the students and the educators.
Yeah, I love that. I learned a lot about policy working at Empower Ed because I kind of brought more of the wellness in, but just to see the way that looking at how it actually change systems to support human beings is a form of wellness has been really exciting for me. Let's ground this in some stories. So leadership is something I think we've all experienced, especially in the workplace. And do y'all have any stories about when leadership was super human centered and it worked for you, or maybe even the opposite where it wasn't, and what happened as a result?
Yeah, I mean, I can start with a story about when I was teaching. I was teaching at DCPS, and what ended up being the last few years of my teaching journey. And I, the first year that I was teaching at this school, so my wife gets pregnant, and I'm like, it's September, October, and I'm like, how do I tell the principal who I just started with, right? That I'm actually going to take a couple months off, right? And it was going to be at the end of the year, right? So she was due in March. And I had to, have that conversation. So I was delaying it as long as I could because I didn't really want to tell this new boss who I really liked. I mean, I felt like everything about him was really, he was very motivational. I absolutely felt that he was human-centered in his approach. I never heard him shame one staff member in front of another, bring that energy. But I still didn't want to have the conversation, right? Because, I think he had very high expectations for people. And so I was like, I'm going to come to this super prepared for to lay out the case for why this is going to be okay. I'm going to be out for 2 months, but I'm going to have all my lesson plans ready and you're going to be fine. And then I went into the conversation and I was like, so I'm going to be asking for paternity leave, and immediately jumped up from his chair and gave me the biggest hug. And he was like, oh, that's so amazing. Oh, I'm so proud of you. That's congratulations. That's so great. And I just felt so relieved in that moment. A little awkward too, because he's 7 feet tall and I am not 7 feet tall. But embraced in his hug and just felt oh my God, that's off my chest now, and so I was kind of dreading the conversation, but ultimately there's no reason to, because he was he was very human-centered in his approach. It was all about the moment for me personally and not about the implications of what it might mean for a substitute or for work in some way. On the other hand, we had a new principal come in later, and that was not how I felt about the work environment. I felt like often in meetings, people were called out individually in front of the whole group. It was not a place where people's ideas were welcome to conflict or challenge in any way, what the leadership was, and it was just not that culture. And 2 years later, I was getting ready to have my second child. And to have the same conversation again, with a very different leader. And it ended up being okay, but it was not a personal conversation. It was not warm, right? It was all business, right? And it's probably appropriate that that was as I was on my way out the door to start Empower Ed when I had that second conversation. It was, partly what is my life going to look like with another kid? But it was just having been under totally different leadership for the last 2 years that was very much not human-centered. I didn't feel the warmth that I did from that, first leader, just a very different place to be in.
That's such a relatable example about how to balance your family and your work life and how leadership can make that happen, or it can make that really difficult in a way, because it's a reality of who we are, that we have families, we have lives outside of that, and how welcome that is in a work environment. Caroline, what about you?
When I was thinking about this question, I wasn't necessarily thinking professionally, actually. I was thinking about my high school sports team, which I feel like I've spoken with both of you about this experience before, but that was such a great experience of team building and just seeing what transformative leadership was over the 4 years that I was on this team. We went from a pretty mid program to a winning program. And that was really exciting. It was a super competitive sports program, and yet it was really the way that our coach built this program was about relational trust, which is something else that we talk about a lot with human-centered leadership. And it was just this idea that we will be doing some difficult workouts, it will be a trying time in some days, but we have each other to rely on. And when you fall behind, there's another girl behind you that can pick up the slack, and we'll do it without needing to be asked, just because we care about one another on the team. And I think that was such a special experience for me. And it's something that I have carried forward in every team I've been on subsequently, including professionally. I think it's just been a really instructive lesson on what, connection can look like in a professional space as well.
And it's especially, we're working with a lot of schools where they have real things they have to do. They have children in those buildings who need support, who need to be learning things, and COVID deficits are real. And it's interesting to look at the style of leadership of the people who are this is really hard, but we're gonna do this, and kind of that we're gonna use connection, and then more of the punitive approach, which is the opposite of human-centered leadership, where it's we're gonna do this and you gotta figure it out, and you actually don't have the support you need.
And we'll talk about it more, but we talk about toxic positivity sometimes, or what that rah-rah kind of looks like from a principal. And most principals will try to inspire in that way. And I think the second leader that I talked about really thought she was inspirational, right? When most of us felt shamed, right, by the way that she was talking. So there is really, in some way there's a formula to it, but it really just is how you are treating people individually as humans that either makes that kind of let's go get this together team kind of mentality feel inspirational to you, or feel like something very different. Do you have a story?
Well, I was thinking about my story, and it's interesting because as you know, I was self-employed for about 15 years. And there was probably a reason that I was self-employed, is that I had 2 back-to-back work experiences in 2 different nonprofits that were where I wasn't onboarded well. Where even the hiring process was very chaotic in both of them. And as soon as I got on board, one of them, my boss was gone for 3 weeks. So I had 3 weeks, and nobody else in the office was able to recognize that I needed anything. And I felt very lost. I didn't have that kind of pivotal moment to be able to form the relationships I needed to form. And so when another organization offered me a job, I went to that. And it was the exact same experience. It was a different thing. They were having a lot of problems as an organization, and just there was nobody there to really mentor me or help me or guide me. And at the end of that experience, I was you know what? I think I can do this better on my own. But it was interesting being self-employed for so long because I had to look at that that internalized lack of human-centered leadership sometimes because there was no one between me and that. Just ways that I would overwork or expect more of myself than I was really able to give in a moment, ways that I couldn't find balance. And I really had to work a lot to be able to set better boundaries with myself and really find that work-life balance. So I think it's interesting we can kind of idealize like, oh, if I didn't have a boss, this whole thing would be so easy. And I'm just here to tell you that that's not the case, and it's something we all need to be really talking about no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of relationship that people have with a good boss, right, and the positive that, that can do. And, people say all the time that people quit bosses, not jobs, right? And I think like a lot of this is about the kind of leadership we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we told some stories. So let's dig into like, how do we really define what human-centered leadership is about? And particularly, what does this look like in a school setting?
Yeah. All right, let's start with what it is, or maybe we'll start with what it isn't. Okay, it may be at risk of embarrassing myself before a whole podcast audience. So I was watching Emily in Paris. And for those who have no context about Emily in Paris, it's, American girl goes to work for French marketing firm, and there's like 3 kind of stars, under the boss, essentially, right? And in the new season, one of them takes a job at another, marketing agency. And the boss kind of says to Emily, she's like, everyone's disposable, Emily, remember that, right? That's not human-centered leadership, right? And the funny thing is about that, like in the context of this show, that like that happens again and again, like they keep losing one of the top talent people, and then she has to like grovel and find a way to get them back in some way. There's not really reflection that everyone's disposable and that attitude might be the problem. I mean, I think human-centered leadership is just that people are the most important part of the organization, right? The organization is made up of people, and the people are your greatest assets. And if you actually take advantage of the skills, if the people feel seen, if the people feel part of a team, that because they feel that way, because their leadership makes them feel that way, they're going to perform at their best. And so it is really about the leadership starting with and focusing on, and the relationships and the trust being built from the people.
I think when I consider what the opposite of human-centered leadership is in schools, I think it becomes reductive to just like the numbers that you have on paper. And we think about like this term like data driven, which is so important and so vital to have like solid data about what's going on in your schools and where the needs are, where the gaps are, where the joyful moments are. But those joyful moments really live off the page, right? And I think human-centered leadership in a school context also means that you are leading with the lived experiences of the students and the educators that work in that school.
Yeah.
And so we're not just trying to like push the numbers ahead, which is something that we see a lot with evaluation scores, with test scores for students. Everyone in the building is so much more than the way they show up just on the page, on paper. And so I think that human-centered leadership is also about in schools making space for the whole person to show up.
Yeah, what's coming to mind for me is curiosity. And we've been doing some workshops and showing this fun clip from Ted Lasso, where he talks about like kind of the mistakes you make in life when you are judgmental, or you assume things about people rather than being curious. But I think that can be a larger lens as well to look at everything of what's going on in your building. And I think this is really hard for leaders because I don't think that like, central office is like super curious, they like want results and they want things to look a certain way. And there's a lot of pressure on the leaders that are in the building, who in turn can pass that pressure on to the teachers, who in turn can pass that pressure on to the families and the students. And a little bit of healthy pressure, I think, is great. But when it starts to look like this has to be this way and we're not going to take time to slow down and figure out why it is that way, or is there a different way that we could be in that way? So I appreciate when we go into a school setting is that we just get a chance to be completely curious for a while of like really talking to teachers, really talking to leaders, like what's going on, and then even be like, could this work? And it's all their tricky problems they're trying to solve in schools. But I do think showing up in that spirit of curiosity, it really opens some doors for something different to happen.
And the thing is that we are not going in to hold them accountable, and so we kind of have that window to do that. But at the same time, the things that they are trying to be held accountable for by the kind of metrics that we use, right, are the things that we're achieving by not paying so much attention to them, right? Especially in those early stages where we are just presenting ourselves as curious and are, right, or just focused on listening. I have a good story of kind of contrast of this, like what does it sound like, right? In terms of being curious and not judgmental, which is, I talked about the principle before where I, really didn't have a strong school culture. I got evaluated once by this leader, and I was teaching, it's appropriate because we're recording this just after Labor Day. I was teaching about labor unions and the labor movement. And the kind of, topic we were on was the progressive era. I was teaching US history, right? And on the evaluation, she told me that she was docking the evaluation because labor unions were not the progressive era. And I was like, how do I have this conversation, right, with her? She came from a science background. She wasn't a social studies person or something. So I pushed back gently, and it was just like not accepted. I think the pushback actually made things worse, right? And I was like, actually, labor unions are a pretty critical part of the teaching the progressive era. And so it was just like a black and white, right? This is, evaluation. On the other hand, I had a instructional coach once, a story I told to some of the folks we're working with in schools, that I was teaching ESL earlier in my years in teaching, and I had just spent a year teaching in Peru, and I was teaching a very kind of grammar heavy, version of ESL. And I got observed for a lesson. She kind of saw that. She saw some students kind of getting lost in the lesson. And she approached me afterwards, and we're kind of debriefing the lesson. And she said, tell me about where you taught before. What were the students like that you taught in Peru? And what we got around to was that, I was teaching students in Peru that actually had a very high level of literacy in their own language, and were learning English as a second language, but they had the complete base of grammar. So they could kind of do the transfer. They, this is the present progressive in my language, and this is what it is in English, and they could apply those lessons. The students that I was teaching here in the US had a very often interrupted education and low level of literacy in their own language. So they needed the vocabulary first, not the grammar. They didn't have a content base to be able to understand that transfer. But she started by asking me questions, right? She was curious about why I might be teaching the way I was teaching and why that lesson turned out that way, right? And that kind of question, instead of judgment, leading with the question instead of leading with the judgment, made me so open to what she taught me. Never forgot it the rest of my time teaching ESL. And I thought it was completely instructive of how a good coach or how a good leader will guide you by being curious, by learning from your own experiences.
Yeah, I really appreciate that story. And I think about the greatest school leader that I had in my experience in the classroom was has been on this podcast before. But one thing that she did really well was recognize that everyone is an expert in something. And that's something that I say a lot in our workshops. But I think that made me feel very seen and valued. Was she would say, okay, I have these pointers for you, but I'm interested in when you were teaching this content, you also pulled this other aspect in, or you also taught about this historical lesson too. And I'm curious why you did that. And I want to learn more about that. And I want to make a space for you to explore that more. And so I think that was really excellent, because it was being curious, not just about how I was teaching, but how I could teach the content in a way that fosters curiosity as well for the students. And I think that it was, I just loved that style of coaching, and it felt really powerful as a new teacher to experience.
Yeah, and it's transparency is trust too, right? So I feel like students always loved when I kind of peeled back the curtain a little bit, and I was like, why am I teaching you this lesson? And often when a lesson wasn't going well, I would kind of stop and be like, look, this is why I'm doing the activity this way. This is why I plan to listen this way. And the student engagement always shot through the roof when I did that, right? Because the students were just like, oh, you spent a lot of time, right, preparing this. Maybe I'll try, right, for a minute. But it's just the transparency of oh, this is the behind the scenes and how we got here. And the same goes for, I think we often don't apply good pedagogical technique to adults. We know this is going to work with students, and then we're just oh, adults, whatever, they just need to be accountable, no excuses, right? But it turns out adults as humans need the same kind of approach to leadership. A teacher with a student as with an admin to a teacher.
Yeah, well, it comes back to just being human. I think that we want permission to be human. We want permission to make mistakes. We want permission to not know. We want permission to take a risk in that way. And if it's not being modeled for us and demonstrated by the adults in the building, it's really hard to do it as students in that way. And just as a pro tip for anyone who's like, I get that curiosity is good and I don't really know how to do that, is like ask a question.
Yeah.
And like the best question to ask is any question. Like, it's like, if you don't know, I think putting that pressure on yourself to be like, but just be like, how do I just like, instead of like telling you how it is or how it should be, how do I just like pull back and just like be like, why did you do that? You know, in that way. And it's like amazing. It is just like a key that can like transform a situation. We've named some of the things that can get in the way of this in the building, which is, I think, externalized pressures for performance.
Yeah.
But what are some of the other things that you think can get in the way of human-centered leadership within a school environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just an ethos, right, that's kind of in the blood sometimes in the way people are trained in education, that is just like a high expectation, students first, no excuses. And it's really sad because like high expectations are good. Actually, they're really, really important, right, to whether students succeed. High expectations for staff are really, really good. We all want to put students first, right? None of these things are inherently bad things. But I think what can happen is when you answer real and persistent challenges that are happening in a classroom or in a school with this just, hey, no excuses, check your feelings at the door, we're here to do a mission, that's not actually addressing the thing that has to be addressed to get past this barrier. I mean, if students are showing up hungry, right, telling a teacher no excuses, it's not, that's not getting past the real barrier to them being able to show up to learn. And it might be pedagogical, right? It might be that like a teacher doesn't have the skill they need to teach literacy, right, in the right way. But the barrier is their pedagogical knowledge, right? It's really good professional development. It's them being able to learn from their peers. And often this kind of like students first, no excuses attitude, what it means is like it creates this like toxic positivity, like we talked about in the building, where people start to not trust each other because they're feeling like anything hard has to kind of be buried. And including their personal life, like, why did you show up 5 minutes late to work? Well, I had all this going on with my kids at home, and they can't show up as a person. So they start to just distrust each other. And the result of that distrust is people go into their corners, right? So like teachers, like, I'm just going to teach my class, I'm going to shut my door. I've had enough initiatives. I've been here long enough to see people are going to come and go, and I'm not going to be part of the team. I'm just going to do my thing. But teams are essential in schools. You can't operate a school in silos in that way. People have to learn from each other and people have to trust each other. So what's sad about this is people are using, in some ways, good justification, right? Like that we absolutely have to have high expectations, that we absolutely, schools are about students fundamentally. So of course, we should be putting the needs of students first in order to create an environment that I think does precisely the opposite, which is it destroys trust. And trust is the essential ingredient to sustainable school improvement.
I think about, there's often this idea that trust allows you to bring your full self to the building, and that's not professional. Which is something that we run up against a lot, is this concept of like what is and isn't professional. And the funny thing is, like, you can be a school that is where everyone is very, very professional. Everyone shows up exactly on time. I think about like the parking lot test, or like everyone is in the lot, all the cars are in the lot 10 minutes before contract hours begin. That doesn't mean that everyone is bought in or connected.
Yeah.
It's building a collaborative space does involve that level of sometimes like just you have to be willing to share about yourself, what you need, what you want, what you hope for in this school year. And I think allowing people to surface that and to share that, and to acknowledge that maybe someone does have to talk a little bit about their background. That doesn't mean that it's not professional. That means that you've created a safe space. And I think that's something else, that we have these sort of like preconceived notions about what is and isn't appropriate when you're just doing students first, students first, students first. You also have to acknowledge like the people that are in front of the students too.
Yeah. And it's a hard thing, I think, for school leaders. Like we work with a lot of school leaders, and I feel a lot of empathy for like the challenges of really making sure that their systems are running well and that they're getting the results, and also how to make space for all of this, a touchy-feely. And we get some school leaders, and I really appreciate this transparency on their part. They're like, this is not my thing. Like I want my staff to be well, and it's not like I don't know how to get up there and kind of lead these conversations. And I really appreciate us being able to be like, but we know. So thank you for inviting us, and thank you for investing in this partnership.
And also, they don't always have to have the conversation themselves, right? I mean, they're creating the container for it, of trust, and there are going to be staff members who don't want to share about their personal lives, and that's totally fine too, right? I mean, thinking about setting boundaries, but also creating a space where everybody feels like they can present in the way they want to, whether they want to share in that way or not, but they do feel that trust. But I think we can't talk about obstacles without talking about the systemic obstacles that are a step above the things we've talked about so far, which is that we do exist in a system that makes it really hard for principals to lead in a human-centered way because they are evaluated in a way that is very much not human-centered, that the principals are evaluated in a way that students are evaluated, the teachers are evaluated, and that our schools themselves are ranked, are rated, evaluated in ways that prioritize, a really not human-centered approach, right? And I think the thing is, this is the research about relational trust, and it's Tony Brick and Barbara Schneider did this work in the University of Chicago in 2003, that I mentioned before, which is that it is the key cornerstone, right, to sustainable school improvement. What the research shows is that actually schools can turn around, and unfortunately it's become a business in the education industry where like a lot of people get invested in school turnaround, they bring in these really, really expensive outside contractors to consult. There's kind of this no excuses mentality, but what it is often this high expectations culture that leads to really quick burnout. Right? They narrow the curriculum. We're going to focus on reading and math because we know that's where we have to see test results. Students don't feel engaged in other ways. So you see chronic absenteeism go up because we're only focusing on subjects that may not be the thing that students are showing up to school for. It kind of destroys the social emotional fabric, but you can invest in a turnaround culture and see test scores climb in a year or two, right? There's formulas to do that. The problem with it is almost every single time those scores go down again, very sharply a couple years from now. Why? Because the teachers leave. The staff turns over. Any new initiative that they were implementing, they've got to start from scratch and do it all over again. Now they have a new school leader. And so the key, the difference between schools that have a little success and then see it fade and the schools that sustain that success over time is whether they have, that relational trust. And the only way to allow school leaders fundamentally, like we can improve a school or two at a time, and we do through our partnerships and through a lot of work on wellness and on building relational trust. But if we want to see this happen across the country, if we want to see this happen systemically, we have to change the way that schools, that teachers, that students, and especially the principals, I think, are evaluated.
I think something else that we've seen and heard from a lot of school leaders is that they just feel like they are in this very precarious position, right? Where they are trying to like shield their staff from these really high pressure directives that are coming down. And it's often like falling just on their shoulders. And so something as well that I think you spoke about earlier, Gracie, is just like a lot of this pressure means that it's really difficult for school leaders to practice self-care often. And so a lot of times we do come in and they're like, I don't really know how to do this for myself.
Haven't taken a vacation in years.
Haven't taken a vacation in years. And I recognize that my staff needs this. And so like, I'm just gonna sort of like hold back the levee while you do this for them. And then hopefully like I can take in some of it for myself, take in some of these practices, but it is like, it's a system that inevitably does lead to burnout. And that burnout falls pretty unevenly on different educators in the building too.
Yeah, it's real. Yeah, I do appreciate that. And I really, seeing the humanity of school leaders is important. And I know that it's controversial sometimes what happens between school leaders and the staff, but just I think to go into a school and see every single person in there as a whole human being is a radical act. And one that is, the more that we do it, the more that I think we can find policies that can really start to inform how to uphold that and make that more of a reality. So Empower Ed, one of our central missions is to promote teacher leadership. And I'm curious about the connections between teacher leadership and human-centered leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think our work, and Caroline can talk more about this, it's human-centered in that the ideas, we fundamentally believe that the ideas have to come from the people closest, right, to the ground, closest to the action. That means we want to support and elevate always student voice, and then we want to listen to the teachers who are closest to the students, and a key connection point in many ways. The teachers are communicating with families, they're also seeing their students every day, and we just believe that if the ideas are coming up from the educators who are in the schools every day, who are experiencing the challenges, who know what the real obstacles to progress are, that those are going to be solutions grounded in reality and that actually have a chance at improving outcomes for kids. So I think what it means to be human-centered in that way is that we are listening to educators, we are valuing their stories, And we're being intentional about that, meaning we're not just, doing a survey of 100 educators and saying like, we know what teachers think now, right? But we are actually interrogating ourselves for, do we have representation right? Like, are we making sure that we have not only an intentionally diverse group of educators that we're listening to, but the educators who are most affected by a particular policy, or who are going through part of their life, for example, where turnover might be high, right? And are we listening to educators about, in that particular group, about what those reasons might be? So in every case that we're thinking about policy, are we going to a group of educators, of teachers, of staff members who really have both the lived experience to have an informed opinion and solutions about it? And, I think sometimes it's important to say, like, we want to be solution oriented. We always say teacher solutions, but that we can't always expect people to have the immediate solution, that it's okay if they're just able to tell us what their lived experience is, but that we believe as a collective, listening to people, especially in an intentional way, that we're going to come up with really good solutions.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think teacher voice for us is often about just like having our ear to the ground. And I think as well that it's really about honoring the lived experience of the folks that are in the classrooms, in the schools. And that's something that policy frankly doesn't always do very well, is honor that lived experience and like how it actually feels to be on the ground doing this work.
Yeah.
Implementing the policies that are being handed down, implementing these practices, seeing how they land with students, seeing how it lands with families. And so definitely, I think that this concept of like teacher voice in the field of human-centered leadership means that we are foregrounding, I guess, the impact over the intent, maybe, and trying to make sure that this really, everything that we are working towards is serving the purposes that it was created for, isn't having like sort of unintended side effects that are forcing people to leave parts of themselves at home or at the door.
And I think we should think about how we celebrate people in that way too, because we talked about how we evaluate people, but we often celebrate people in ways that people or schools in ways that provide perverse incentives to not have human-centered, right, leadership too. So I think, I've been part of schools where there's a really positive like call out culture of like celebrating everything that people are doing. But sometimes it's like, look, we have 3 categories here. We're celebrating, growth in this area. And it's, it's very routine, very structured, and often very academic, but often the inputs that are producing really good academic outputs so that you've created this amazing container of trust in your classroom, right? And if people are really, really good at creating that trust with their students, right, or creating that trust with their colleagues, they're having a multiplying effect on the whole school and their outcomes, but we're not often celebrating that in the same way when it comes to celebrating how school leaders are, but also how our students and how our teachers are.
Yeah, something we are doing this year at Empower Ed is we have a number of partner schools where we're helping them to develop teacher mentorship programs. And it's something that there's a lot of evidence that like new teachers, especially having a mentor is going to help them throughout their career and help them stay in the profession. And yet not many schools that we're finding here in DC really have well-established teacher mentorship programs. So that's a great place for us to come in because we have this teacher leadership focus to be like, who are the people who are good at that, who can set up these containers of trust, who like, who know how to teach this super well and have a little bit of extra capacity. And what can we give them a little bit of compensation, a little bit of time, and to be able to do that for their colleagues. And just so far, what we've been finding is it's really exciting just to see how even just a little bit of structure around that is like really one school in particular where they've said like onboarding has just been, it's something we're not good at. And even us going in and doing like a 90-minute workshop, we're just giving people a chance to talk about some of the systems at the school, some of the things they're hoping for this year. At the end, everyone came out being like, yeah, I feel really good. And like, so just looking at ways that we can uplift the leadership of teachers within the building to be supportive staff members and to have the capacity for that has been exciting. And we're gonna do some podcast episodes on that this year to share more.
I mean, a lot of these things like seem like they're so basic, like be curious, ask good questions, be more human-centered, care about the individual people, but they are learned skills a lot of times too. There's obviously a disposition, right? The principal who like gave me that hug versus, another leader, like, part of that is who they are, but part of it is wisdom gained through experience too, that that they might have gone through similar things in their life, and so they're able to kind of prioritize the human first, or but it is just often these are things that people do need to learn, right? And I think that when we're able to create peer supports for them through a mentorship program or a peer support program, people can share that expertise with each other. And I think there's almost nothing more powerful in a school than when you really have an open environment where teachers and staff are constantly learning from each other, that they're trusting each other, and that they're helping each other grow. And I think that's something that you can walk down the hallway of a school and see in just a few minutes. And if we paid a little more attention to that, we'd probably be getting there as a system.
Okay, as we close up here, I'm curious, how do we keep it human around here at Empower Ed? What are some of the things that we're thinking about? Because it's interesting because we're in school sometimes and they're like talking about meetings or things. I'm like, wait, how do we do that? I'm like, how do we ensure that that happens? And it's thought-provoking for me too.
Yeah, I mean, I think we try to share a lot with each other. We try to practice what we preach around. We have some wellness days where it's just our team. I think we always start our meetings talking about something personal or sharing in some way or answering a question or doing some tarot cards or something. But, we try to start with ourselves as humans. And I think try to practice flexibility. We've talked a lot about, flexible scheduling in terms of schools, but trying to practice that same thing, hopefully with our team and our staff and just, seeing that, if we are not filling our own cups, we're not doing that for schools, just like we ask, schools to do for their staff. So I think just, putting the people and our stories and our lives, at the center of our work, and in many ways is why we're doing it.
I found, just because I think I'm the
Yeah.
I know I'm the newest member of the team. I found this to be like a really supportive team to come on board with. And I think it was a pretty big life transition for me when I joined Empower Ed. And when I was kind of nervous about, honestly. But everyone has been so supportive and just helping me find confidence in some of my skills. I honestly am a person that has a lot of difficulty saying if I have too much on my plate, I really can't take another thing. And I think seeing that modeled by everyone, I really do feel that we practice what we preach in terms of just ensuring that each person has the capacity to do their job well, to be themselves inside and outside of the building. And so I really appreciate that.
Well, we're happy you're here.
Appreciate
it. Yeah. And two things come to mind for me. One is that I think there's a lot of space that we have to kind of be excited about something we're excited about and to practice the leadership that we want to practice. I look at, Scott, you're obviously, the one who's doing the paychecks and everything like that. But I feel like we share that leadership really well, that there's certain things that certain people take more leadership over if we're excited to create something. Like Caroline, you're creating the Black Educators social network.
Yes.
Can I drop that here?
Yeah, we can have a little preview of that. It's gonna be called Rest and Rise. We think it's the working title. But very excited to see that come off the ground.
Yeah, so just to be able to have that space, I think is important. And I see that in schools too, for educators to be able to bring the skill sets that they're passionate about, find a way to positively contribute to the environment and the ecosystem. It's great. And then I also see Empower Ed is we're small, 3 people, but we also exist within a lot, a big ecosystem of schools, of other partner organizations, Empower Ed's Fellows program. And I think that I see us very generously interacting. We take from those organizations that people support us and care about us and attend our events and invite us to their events. And then we also can give a lot to those organizations. So even though we're small, I feel like we really have a huge network and that we interact a lot with that. And that feeling of being supportive and supported, I think, is a big part of human-centered leadership as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation, thought-provoking for me. I hope for other people too. And we look forward to the season. We have a lot of great episodes coming up, and we'll keep weaving this theme back in because I do think it's a really central one for this Educator Wellness Revolution we're looking to have here.
All right. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.